Okay, sorry guys. The whole second half of the video I did for this week had some problems with the sound, so I apologize that I'm having to do this later. I had technical problems first, and I was trying to get it posted originally, and I realized that the whole second half was garbled, and I've just had some timing issues being able to get this finished, and now getting it uploaded to you may take me a little bit other time because of some technical issues. Doesn't matter. I'm getting it done. Sorry to be having it run a little late this week. But okay, so I want to step back real quickly and sort of give you a big picture view of what Hume's doing here, where we're ultimately going, so that you can have a little more. Because I know I've already gotten a few questions from people about how this week's reading is even after I shortened it is difficult, and I know that. So the real place Hume is going with all of this is he wants to make a case that in the simplest sense, he's going to say we don't really know for a fact with certainty anything about the world. That all we can really know with certainty are the things that we have that are impressions, like that I'm actually feeling something right now, that I'm actually seeing something right now. And it's just those impressions that we get. That's real knowledge. That's something that we can be certain about. But anytime we try to explain connections between those impressions or what lies behind those impressions, that's when we're getting into storytelling and habit rather than things that we actually know. And he's going to make a big case about how causation, and what he really means by causation is any way that we actually explain why something happens or where something comes from or what leads to something else. Causation is the foundation of any explanation. He's going to say we never actually experience that. We always sort of come up with that after the fact as a way to explain other things that we've experienced. But he's going to make a point that causation is something we never have a direct experience of. And if, as human beings, everything we learn about is something that has to come through experience, through us having experienced it, then causation too would have to be something we experience, but we never do. All we ever really see is this happens, then this happens. And we might see that over and over and over again, but we never actually experience causation. All we ever experience is that this thing followed this other thing over and over and over again. So, like I said last time, he's a skeptic. And that's really the big challenge he's trying to make, that we get along in the world. We have to act like we know things. But when it comes to actual certain knowledge of things that we can be 100% confident that we know about the world around us, Hume's going to say our minds are really just not equipped, not set up to actually know something about that. Okay, so I'm going to walk through the rest of it, but that's where we're going. That's what all of this stuff is really pointing for. And that's the big view that Hume's trying to get out. So we stopped last time with his point about there being two different kinds of things that we can know. Hume's fork, about how there were logical necessities, that we can know that about math because that's just how things are by definition, that 2 plus 2 just by definition equals 4, that 4 by definition is two things and two things. But there's that, and then there are matters of fact, which are things that we've experienced about the world. Okay, but as I said, part of the reason he brings those two things up is because he wants to point out that something like causation, like an actual explanation of what's going on in the world, that may not fit in either category. And so there may really, in the end, be no justification that we have for things like causation or explanations or why explanations of the world. So let's get into that. The big problem that he talks about is the problem of induction. Okay, and so what is induction? First of all, just a good definition. Induction is just when you take a whole bunch of, in our case, experiences and try to draw some kind of conclusion about all of those experiences. You have all of the individual facts, and you say, from that, I'm going to draw a conclusion. Like, every morning when I wake up, the sun rises. My conclusion from that I could induce or that I could draw from that is that the sun will always rise in the morning. Okay, so I can take something from the past that I've seen and say it's always happened that way in the past. It'll probably always happen that way in the future. That's an example of induction. The opposite of induction is deduction. And deduction is where you take like a definition of something and apply that in the world. So that would be like, I see 4 apples. I can deduce that if I took 2 apples away, I would be left with 2. I don't need to directly experience that, but I know by definition that's how things work. That's deduction. So induction and deduction are sort of the 2 ways that we can say we learn things about the world. That goes back to his 2 kinds of knowledge, where if it's a matter of logical necessity, that involves deduction. Matters of fact are matters of induction, of cases where what we're doing is we're taking experiences that we've had and drawing conclusions from those experiences that are really sort of like looking at patterns over time. That's induction, okay? And he specifically is asking the question of induction of why we can't, or how can we prove that the future will be like the past? That all the other things we've experienced in our lives will still give us knowledge, hopefully, about things in the future. That's why he's going to start saying part of induction. And this is really the part of Hume's argument that in the long run has caused the most trouble and why he became so famous and got a lot of people really worked up and hot and bothered. But it's also genuinely still one of the most important philosophical problems that anyone has ever raised, and that most of modern philosophy is responding to when it comes to epistemology. So here's how he talks about it. If all of our knowledge about the real world, let's get to the next slide. If all of our knowledge depends on experience, so all of our knowledge about the real world depends on experience, and we learn cause and effect from experience, from seeing things happen over and over, then our ability to predict the future depends entirely on the assumption that the future is going to always work the way the past did. And you might say, well, that seems logical. And he's like, yeah, but it seems logical and it seems reasonable, but how certain is it? How much can we really rely on that? So he gives examples. He says that when you expect that bread will nourish you tomorrow, you're assuming that tomorrow's bread will behave like all the bread you've ever eaten before. Okay. But it also, science works this way, that when scientists predict what will happen in an experiment, they're assuming that nature behaves consistently. If you don't assume that nature behaves consistently, you basically don't have science, because what science is all about is induction, is all about drawing conclusions from repeated experiences, repeated data. Okay. But here's Hume's question. What actually justifies that assumption that the future will always be like the past? What reason do we actually have to believe that the future will always work like the past has? You might say, well, experience just justifies it. Just in my experience, the future has always resembled the past. But Hume points out that this example is circular. And this is kind of the problem with induction. And it's circular because he says a circular argument is one where you use the thing you're trying to prove the thing. So in this case, the way most people would justify that the future is going to look like the past, or that the past is a good guide, is by saying, well, the past has always told me what the future is going to be like. But that's a circular argument. Works like this. So you're saying in effect that induction has always worked before, and therefore induction will always work in the future. But that in itself is an inductive argument. Okay, you're assuming the very thing that you're trying to prove, and that's kind of what I've tried to point out, to put in the slide here, is that the problem of induction is that the only way to prove induction that we have is a circular argument. In other words, the only way you can say that the things that I've experienced in the past that are regular will still work in the future is because they've worked in the past. But that's a circular argument. It's always been that way, and so it's always going to be that way. Well, how do you know it's always going to be that way? Well, because it's always been that way in the past. It's like, well, that's exactly the thing I'm trying to say. Why should I believe that the past is a good guide? Well, because things have always worked in the past. Okay, but that's the exact same thing I want you to prove. So it's a circular argument. And that's what, when people say it's a circular argument, that's what they mean. You're depending on, or you're relying on, or assuming the thing that you're actually trying to prove. And that's part of the problem of induction. That's how we justify induction, is a circular argument. There is no other way really to do it. And logic can't help you here either, really. There's no logical contradiction in imagining that tomorrow the laws of nature are going to change. Even science would admit that if science says tomorrow all of a sudden laws look different, it's not that the universe has insulted science, it's that we just got to change our science. We've got to change our theories and our laws to fit with what the facts are. Bread could be poisonous. Fire could stop producing heat. There are cases where in certain conditions fire doesn't produce heat. There is poisonous bread. There are mornings when the sun doesn't rise. They may be far in the future, but they're going to become a time when the sun doesn't rise in the morning. And so, these are just things that haven't happened yet, but they're certainly conceivable. Logic can't rule them out. Okay. So Hume's ultimate conclusion here is that there's no rational justification for our belief that the future will always resemble the past. We believe on it, we act on it constantly, and we have to, but we can't prove it. That's the problem of induction. And it's still considered one of the deepest sort of unsolved problems in the philosophy of science, that the very scientific method depends on an assumption that really can't be proved, that we in some ways have to take on faith, that the past will always be like the future, that nature is consistent. That may be what we've seen throughout history, but that doesn't mean that there's something that rules out that it could never happen and never be different. So now, if you're paying attention to the reading, you may notice there's a little section here where Hume starts talking about custom and habit. And he does this in order to say, look, this is what we do. This is not something that he thinks is bad and that we should stop doing. Instead, what he wants to say is we just need to be honest about what the human mind can know and what it can't really know, and what we actually do. Okay. So Hume doesn't really leave us completely stranded. He doesn't just say, yeah, we can't know for certain that the past or that the future will be like the past, so we just should throw our hands up and say, I guess we just can't know anything. He doesn't do that at all. Instead, he has an answer to why we actually reason the way we do, and why that's practically justified, even if it's not really philosophically justified. And so what he really wants to do is say that what people do is there's a psychological reason why we believe in induction, but there's not really a good logical or philosophical reason to really believe it 100%. Okay. So his answer is that we have habits, or we have what he calls custom. Okay. Let me change the slide. So we have habits, a good way for us to use it. The word custom was much more common back then and in England or Scotland where he was writing. But habit is a good way to think about it. And so what he says is that our minds just naturally, when we observe the same two things happening over and over and over again, our mind gets trained to expect the one thing when you see the other. Okay, and this is a good thing. So you've seen flame and heat together, for example, so many times that the moment you see flame, your mind is automatically going to expect heat. You don't need to sit there and think about it. You don't need to somehow deduce, oh, I know that flame always accompanies heat, therefore when I see flame, I should do it. No, it's a habit, right? It just immediately, automatically. You don't run some kind of logical proof. You don't think about it. It just happens. It's a natural tendency that is literally built into us through repeated experience. And Hume actually says this is like the great gift of human life, because without this tendency to expect the future to look like the past, we couldn't function, right? We wouldn't be able to plan anything. We couldn't survive. So he's not saying that our habits are wrong or that we should stop relying on them or something like that. He's just saying that we should be honest about what they are, and they're trained instincts that we have, not logical conclusions. Um, and he makes a point here that I think is actually worth pausing on for a second. So he talks about how, even children and animals improve through experience, right? Like a dog will learn that, certain sounds mean that it's gonna get food. Now he didn't have can openers back then, but I know my dog. If it hears the can opener, it knows it's going to get some wet food that day, and it's excited. Um, you know, or a small child learns not to touch the stove, right? A little kid is not going to sit there and think, "Oh, I have twice experienced that when I touch a stove, I should hurt my or I will hurt my hand, and so I should not do it." No, they're just going to get trained by one or two times of saying, "Oh, if I do that again, I'm probably going to get hurt." But they don't really think about it. They're just like stove hot, stove bad, don't touch, right? It's more something like that. Um, Creatures and children, they're not running philosophical arguments. They're not doing sort of logical deductions or anything. They're just being trained by experience. And at root, Hume says, our belief or our sense that the future is always going to look like the past, that's the same kind of thing. It's that learned behavior that luckily, we should be grateful we have, because it allows us to constantly be learning from experience and projecting that on the future. And that's one good thing about how the human mind works. The point that he wants to make, though, is that that doesn't mean that we can call that true knowledge about the world. That's the limit he's trying to make. And specifically, where that comes up is when he starts talking about causation. But I wanted to point that out real quickly, that he has this section on habit and custom because he wants to stress that he's not saying you can't know for sure lots of things and so therefore you should just give up. On the contrary, he's saying, no, this is because of our minds are able to do this. That's a wonderful thing. It's what gives us all kinds of power and function, but we need to be honest about what it's actually, how our minds actually function and what they're actually capable of knowing about the world and what they're not. So the way this finally comes up for him, and really the ultimate big point for Hume, is about causation. And his question is, he's going to take everything he's been saying and sort of really apply that to the very notion of causation, which for him is a way to think about what's at the heart of every explanation of anything. Anytime you explain something, anytime you think you know something about something, you're going to offer an explanation for it. That explanation is going to involve causation. This happens because some other thing happens, or this happens because certain circumstances were in place. That's really the basis of any explanation. And science really does look for causation as much as it possibly can. It tries to come up with better and better accounts of what causes what by looking at data. But what Hume's going to say is anytime we rely on causation, we're actually relying on a story, not on something that we can say we actually know. That causation is going to be something that we always project onto experiences we've had in the past, or that we project onto impressions and experiences that we've had. But we never experience causation itself. We never actually can directly experience one thing causing something else to happen. All we're ever going to see is one thing happened, then something else happened. And we might see that over and over and over again. But even if we never saw an exception to the rule, he's going to say we still never actually see causation or experience causation. Causation is always going to be something like a story that we tell after the fact about that. And what that means then is causation, or any explanation of anything in the world, really any why answer, is going to be a story that we project onto the world, not something that we can actually directly see or experience in the world. Okay, so let's look at that. Let's look at how he makes that point. And you may have heard especially scientists will often talk about how correlation is not causation. That's a phrase you may have heard before, but the difference between correlation and causation. Correlation is when you see certain things happen over and over and over and over again in relationship with each other. And scientists are always on the lookout for, mistaking a correlation for causation. A goofy example of that would be like, okay, yeah, let's use the sun rising. So if you think that, every morning when I wake up, the sun rises. And so I'm always correlating, the morning with the sun rising. Well, that must mean, therefore, that I cause the sun to rise every morning by waking up. And if I slept in one day, then the sun would not rise. Well, that's making a mistake between a correlation and a causation, right? Just because every day in your life the sun has risen when you woke up, that doesn't mean that you're causing the sun to rise, right? That's a silly example, but nonetheless, that's sort of the problem that we're going to get into. All we ever experience, Hume says, are correlations. We never actually experience causation. And in many ways, science says the same thing. Science is all about finding better explanations of causation by looking at ever more new and more detailed correlations. And a very honest scientist will say that anytime they quote unquote explain something, what they're doing is just giving the best explanation that they have so far. But any scientist who comes out and tries to say, I have discovered the cause, and there will never be any data that will violate this cause, and this is a law of the universe and it can never be violated, that's literally something they don't know. That's literally something we can't say. That's similar to what Hume's point is with this. So, okay, let's work through sort of the way that he does this in a little bit more. And this really is the sort of philosophical core, the part of what he's trying to get at. So ultimately what he does is he takes that impressions test, Hume's fork, where he says, is this either a direct impression of something, or is this a matter of fact about something that we see that's like a connection between two ideas? And he applies that to causation itself. And he says not just to our reasoning about cause and effect, but to the concept of causation itself as we normally understand it. So he says, think of it this way. When we say that one billiard ball or one pool ball, pool with like cue balls and the 8-ball and all that, when we say that one ball causes another ball to move, we usually mean more than just that the second ball happened to move after the first one was hit, right? That's what we mean by cause. Cause means this thing necessarily caused this other thing to do something. We mean that first ball's motion made the second ball's motion happen. That it was the direct and necessary force that caused that thing to happen. The second ball had to move. There was no choice. There was no question about it. If something causes something else, it forces something by necessity to do something else. It could not have done otherwise. And we consider that the necessary connection between cause and effect. Without that, we're not really talking about causation, right? So anytime we talk about causation, we really do mean some kind of necessary consequence of something happening. Hume's question, though, is where does that idea or that sense of necessity come from? What experience produced it? Because what he's going to say is you can look at those pool balls, those billiard balls, as carefully as you want to. You can slow them down. You can investigate it a million times. All you are ever going to see is ball A moving, hitting the second ball, and then the second ball moving. Over and over. That's the one thing you're going to see. One thing followed by another thing. Over and over and over again. At what point do you actually see that force of causation in that experience? You see one thing hit and then you see the other thing move. But you never actually see a connection. You see a sequence of things. You never, ever see causation. You only ever see one thing happen and then another thing happen. Okay? that's sort of his point, is that there never is an experience of causation. There's only ever what we say is causation of the force of the one ball was transferred to the second ball, which had to have conservation of mass and energy. Those are all explanations that we use after the fact to explain the things that we see over and over again. But we never, ever experience direct causation in any form, Hume said. All we ever see are sequences of things. All we ever actually experience, in other words, are correlations, are things that happen in relationship to one another. But we never experience causation under any conditions. So sometimes people might say one of the first initial responses to Hume here was that maybe somehow the experience of necessity can like come from inside, from our own minds. Like an example of like, well, I'm going to decide to move my arm and there I go, I'm moving my arm. But do you actually like feel the power of your will? Do you actually experience the necessity of that? Do you actually experience yourself causing something to happen? And Hume would say you really don't. Okay, so think about it, right? You've none of us really have any idea how our decision to move our arm or whatever actually produces the movement. Do we think about the muscles involved? Are we aware of the muscles involved? Are we aware of the nerves firing that actually do that, or the chemical processes that have to be there to turn glucose into energy that allows the muscles to move? Right? No, we don't. We are totally 100% in the dark about the actual mechanism that's supposedly causing this to happen. All we notice is that the movement always follows the decision, right? It's always just, I'm going to move my arm, and my arm moves, right? And you know, we don't even think about it quite that way in terms of like, I'm going to decide to move my arm. There I go. You know, it doesn't work that way. I just move my arm. It's all it is. But there's no separate experience of necessity, a separate experience of causation that's actually there, right? The connection between the two things that happen, it's just as mysterious to you as the billiard balls. You experience the sequence, but you never experience whatever that necessity is. It's always just one thing followed by another thing. Okay, and ultimately, this is Hume's sort of most radical conclusion. And what he tries to say is this: the sense of necessity we feel when we think about causation doesn't come from actually observing anything in the world. You never experience causation. You never experience or observe causation in the world at all. It always comes from, ultimately, from our sense of habit. That when we see regular things happen, we figure there must be a causation involved. After you see ball A strike ball B 100 times, your mind has been basically trained to expect to see B move the moment it sees A move. And that trained expectation feels necessary, but that necessity is in your mind. It's not in the world. And all that ever happens in the world that we can experience is this thing happened, then that thing happened. The necessity, the causation, that's always something that we project onto the world. And this really kind of connects back to everything he said before. So we rely on causal reasoning to know about the world, how to get along in it, right? We rely on that. But we have no real rational justification for expecting that cause and effect are still going to hold in the future. All we just know is that in the past, it's always worked before. And now we turn that on the idea of causation itself, the idea that causes have to produce their effects. That's not something we learn from nature, right? That's never something we actually experience. All we ever experience is just seeing things happen in correlation. And our minds are trained and habituated to find that as causation. But here's Hume's point. Causation may not exist in the world. Causation only ever exists in our minds, on what we project onto the world, the stories we tell about the world, the explanations we might come up with about the world. But do we know that these causations are actually there in the world? No. Um, it's an analogous argument to something I'm sure lots of you have thought about before, especially when you're learning about in biology about how your senses work, and the strange sort of realization you can have that everything that we see about the world, or hear, or touch, or whatnot, all of the sort of sensory experiences we have about the world are not what the world is actually like, right? Like think about vision. What our vision does is it takes a very narrow spectrum of wavelength of light, and it hits our eyeballs, and then our eyeballs translate that as information that goes to our brain, and our brain then creates literally what we experience as images of the world around us. But is what we see actually there in the world? Like when I look at this screen, which, has a dark mode on it right now, and has white letters, and a picture of me up in the corner, is that actually what someone who doesn't have my kind of brain, but who can see what's really there in the world, is going to see? No. No, I mean a sort of godlike being would see the X-rays and the infrared rays and everything else all at once, and maybe even that creature would have to be translating those light forms into some kind of picture. Or the same thing with sound. Like sound is not something that's actually there in the world. Sound is just the movement of air, the vibrations in the air, and it's the way that our mind takes that information and then interprets it for us as a way that we can understand it. But it's kind of like saying, literally, if a tree falls in the forest and no one's around to hear it, does it make a sound? The answer is no. It doesn't make a sound. It makes vibrations in the air, but a sound is only there when there's a human or a creature that has an ear that can set up, that can interpret those sounds to do it. So what we see and what we hear, what we sense about the world, literally is only in our minds. Hume's saying the same thing. He's just expanding it not just to our sense explanations, but even to explanation itself, causation itself. That really, it might just be that our minds are habituated to think of the world in terms of causation. But is there actual causation in the world? Hume would say, we just don't know. We have to act like there is, because that's the only way we get along in the world. But does that mean that it actually is that way in the world? And Hume would say, no, might not be. He's not saying it's not. He's literally saying we don't know. That's why he's a skeptic in the end, like I was saying. So I hope that helps with sort of what's the idea behind this. And part of the reason I wanted to start with Hume was because this is one of the most extreme pictures of sort of how, of some difficult knowledge questions, epistemological questions. And the problem of induction, the problem of causation, is one that really every scientist deals with. It's built into the scientific method. That if the scientific method didn't sort of recognize at some level that causation is always just a story or just a theory that we have, and never something that we can take as 100% true, it wouldn't function. We'd just sort of be like, oh, we found an explanation that works, good, done. But we'd never look for new data. We'd never look for new experiences. We'd never look for new facts that mean we have to go back and revise what we had thought of as a good explanation. So an honest scientist will tell you every theory is an approximation, but it's not a statement of what is 100% true. We just don't know yet, because we haven't experienced everything in the world that could ever possibly be experienced. That's the only way, according to this, that you could ever say that you actually know something. But as long as the future is still there, things could change. We could learn new information. New things could happen. So that's what Hume's getting at. One thing I want to say too is this is a difficult thought experiment, and it's long, and as you've seen, there are many parts to it. When I teach this in a regular classroom, I get the chance to go back and forth with people who have a lot of questions or who disagree with what's going on, so that I can sort of go back and forth and help you see what Hume's thinking to help understand his position. Part of the reason why I wanted to say the thing about AI that I did at the beginning is that in an asynchronous course like this, using AI as a sort of conversation partner can be really helpful, especially if you have a difficult reading or a difficult topic that you're just not feeling all that confident with. And one great thing you can do is go to one of the chat bots and say, hey, I want you to pretend to be David Hume, arguing his point about the problem of induction or causation. Here's why I think he's wrong, or here's something that doesn't make any sense to me, or that seems wrong about what he's saying. Could you tell me how Hume would respond so I can understand what's going on here? That's actually an incredibly useful way of using AI to help you understand material. And so I encourage people to do that. I do that myself with lots of things that I am learning. I wish you hit some things when you're deep in the weeds of stuff that it may not know so much about, but especially with topics like I'm teaching myself coding right now, and some weird things in Python and JavaScript, and I do that kind of back and forth with them all the time. I'm not going to learn so much if I just say, hey, write me this program. But if I'm like, hey, here's a thing I wrote, tell me why this is not the best way to do it, and what would a better software engineer do? It helps me learn. And you can do the exact same thing with really any content, especially if you want to upload the reading from this week, or point it to them. I guarantee you all the major chatbots know about Hume's arguments, because I've tried. I've looked at them to see if they do. But you can also upload the material itself, and it's in the public domain, so you're not going to be breaking any copyright issues. But you can do it, and it'll try to point to specific things in the text and try to explain that to you. So just a little aside. But I want to end with just a couple more points to come back to the one and the many, an issue that, like I said, we're going to use as a way to understand and sort of categorize lots of different philosophers as a good analogy to work with. So I want to connect that to Hume directly. And so remember first how the tension works. The one refers to the idea that underneath all the variety, all the change and complexity of the world, there's some single unified thing, right? Some single principle or truth that holds everything together. And then the many refers to the opposite, that reality really is plural and has many different ways of looking at it, consists of many different things that don't really reduce to one underlying unity. So when we look, say, at Descartes was a one thinker about knowledge, because he believed that reason could give us like a unified, and importantly here, a certain, rationally grounded picture of reality, right? There was one single foundation, the cogito, the thinking thing, and then one method, systematic doubt. And ultimately, as I said, he went through God. He said that God wouldn't ever deceive us. And through all that, Descartes thought he was able to rebuild all the knowledge in the world. But it's based on that one thing. He thought that if we can find that one Archimedean point, the cogito, the thing that cannot be doubted, we can rebuild the rest of the world from that. That's a one thinker. Hume is a many thinker, and it pretty much shows up at just about every level of his argument, right? I mean, his fork idea already splits reality into two different domains that really don't ever cross over. There's the necessary world of logic and mathematics, and then there's the sort of contingent and experiential, the sort of always uncertain world of matters of facts on the other. And, they're genuinely different and separate. And when Hume looks at the world of facts, of matter of facts, what he finds isn't unity, but just sequence, right? Just this thing, then this thing, then this thing. Even if you see the same thing follow each other over and over again, he's going to stress it could still be different tomorrow. All right. That's the many, if anything is the many. So when we look at all that and we want to see a sort of necessary unified structure underneath it, for Hume, like any kind of causal order that holds everything together and make it make sense, Hume says that unity is not in the world. It's in us. It's only in our heads, and it comes from our habits. The necessity that we think we might see in nature, that's something we project onto it because our mind's been trained by habit to expect that. to be there. But if you take that habit away, then Hume says all that's really left is just one thing happening after another, with nothing really observable binding them together. No causation. So Hume is one of the thinkers of the many, sort of par excellence. Like he is an extreme version of the many, and that's a good way to think about him. So so I want to close connecting Hume to a little bit more of the a bigger picture of this unit. Um, so we had Descartes, who was doubting everything, but really with the point of rebuilding all of our knowledge. Hume's kind of doing something from the opposite side, saying we really want to be certain about things, and our minds may be habituated to think that to make us feel like we can have knowledge and certainty about things, but in reality, we can't. So Hume, in a way, is kind of a response to Descartes, and he truly was a response to Descartes' project. And his response was just simply, yeah, that's not going to work, right? Reason is powerful in its own domain. In math or logic, it's great to deduce things there, but when it comes to the actual world, Hume says, the world of like matter and experience and cause and effect, reason does not give you certainty. All you have really is experience, and experience can't justify its own reliability. All it can show you is that it might have always been reliable before, but it can never guarantee that it's still going to be reliable in the future. That foundation that you might be looking for, Hume's going to say, just not there. It's just not there. So that's why Hume is so controversial. That's also why he's important. You know, he's not just raising a sort of interesting puzzle about our minds, but he's really challenging the whole. When you know about intellectual history a little bit more, he's challenging the whole Enlightenment project of really trying to come up with a secure, rational ground of human knowledge. And he's saying, look, it just may not really be there. But the questions that he raises about induction and causation and about what we can actually know in the world, they're still really live philosophical questions today. And like I said, still discussed in science all the time. And, you know, just to let you know how important he was, we've already read a little bit of Kant, but Kant actually wrote after Hume. And Kant said that Hume was the person who sort of grabbed him by the collar and made him pay attention to philosophy, because Kant read Hume and did not like what he read. He said that can't be all that our minds do. We have to be able to have more certain knowledge than that. I just firmly believe that human beings must be able to have more certain knowledge than just these habitual things. And he devoted his life to trying to come up with a good answer to Hume. Not just saying Hume's wrong and you know, I disagree, but really saying, you know, the problem with Hume was that Kant thought he was right. He just didn't go far enough. So Kant wrote an incredibly long book called The Critique of Pure Reason, which really begins by saying what Hume says is right, but it's not the whole story. And so Kant, if you found Hume difficult, Kant's book is incredibly difficult. But it's fun when you get into it and start to see the way that he does try to build some kinds of certainty out of exactly the situation that Hume talks about, with impressions and what it's like for us, what our minds do. And Kant finds a way to actually solve these problems, maybe. But I'll leave that for another time. We're not going to get into Kant's answer to Hume because it's very complicated. But just if you are interested in sort of history of philosophy, what really did happen was Hume bothered Kant so much that Kant had to write books and books and books responding to him. So there's a lot here. This is one of the more complicated readings we're going to have, especially for 1 week. That's why I wanted to simplify parts of it and really help you focus on the most important things. Let me know if you have questions. Let me know if I can help. For the discussion board this week, it really is a trial. Okay, it really is practice. So if you're not comfortable with Hume and taking a side on his issue, that's okay. What I'm really looking for in the discussion board is you taking a stab at starting to try to pull this apart. And on the discussion boards, I'm not really checking whether you're right or wrong about the philosophers. I'm really looking for how you're engaging with them and trying to think through the issues. So don't worry about that. This one in particular this week, I don't expect everyone to have internalized all of Hume's ideas. I want you to work with them and try them out, take a stab at either support agreeing with them or disagreeing with them. But I know this week is a little more challenging than some of the stuff that we've had so far. That's why I mentioned AI, and that's what the discussion board is there for you to try things. But I'm also happy to respond in email, and I already have to a few people. But anyway, sorry again about not having the second part up there at the beginning, but it should be up there. It's there now. Okay. Take care, guys. We'll talk next week.